We're just finishing the introduction to Pirkei Avos. The Talmud is divided into 6 sections. The first section of the Talmud is known as Zroim. It discusses the laws of planting, crossbreeding crops, the laws of the sabbatical year, many laws which pertain. Zroim means seeds. The second section of Talmud is known as Moed. Moed means times. It's laws which pertain to Shabbos, to the festivals, to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Those are times. And then we have Noshim, laws which pertain to women, meaning marriage, divorce, the laws of suspected adulteress. That's included within the section of Noshim. And then we have Nezikin, the section of Talmud which is known as torts, damages, ownership laws, the laws of the Sanhedrin, the court which adjudicates the cases, levels of liability for transgressions, corporal punishment, all these things. Then we have the section known as Kodoshim, the section of the Talmud which discusses the laws of sacrifices. Who's qualified to officiate in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash, who's not, the laws, what determines whether an animal is qualified to be a sacrifice, what invalidates the service, what doesn't invalidate the service. That's the 5th section. The 6th section is known as Tarus, the laws which relate to spiritual purity. For instance, the laws of mikvah. That's the spiritual pool. Person's contaminated, how one relieves himself of this contamination. What qualifies a mikvah to be mikvah? Those laws, the laws of family purity. This is part of Taros. So 6 sections. That's known as Toshbal Peh. We have the 5 Chumoshim, the 5 books of Moses. And then we have the 6 sections of the oral law, which fully flesh out the written law, which is God's interpretation of what he meant when he wrote the laws in the 5 in the written law. The oral law is God's interpretation of what he meant and what he said. And there are many subcategories of that. And it's unending, the depth and breadth of the oral law. But without God's oral law, every verse, every word can be open for endless interpretations. But the question is, what did God mean? And God was very succinct and very exact and specific, exactly what he meant. And that was given to Moshe at Sinai, communicated to the Jewish people. Until today, Judaism is based not only on the printed book, which we call the Chumash, which Chumash comes from where the 5th, each volume is a 5th of the totality. It's the Talmud. It's based on the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, Rambam, who's the codifier, and other commentators, early commentators, which gives us an understanding of what the oral law is, to be able to process it and apply it and execute it. All this was from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's interesting, there's an expression, you play the game of telephone. A story begins at one point, and by the time it reaches the 100th person, it's a different story. And if we're dealing over millennia, from Sinai till today, we're talking about close to 4,000 years. The oral law has been transmitted from generation to generation to generation. And it's been transmitted in that exact context that it was given at Sinai. Now, how do we know? Maybe it's a game of telephone, because if you ever study the Talmud, the only person who's qualified to be the transmitter is a person who has certain qualifications. And when he states the law, he has to trace it to its source. And sometimes he has to mention 6 people to give it credibility. Otherwise, it's not credible. And the person, even the one who gives the transmission, he has to be a credible person. If very often the times where he doesn't speak precise and accurately, he cannot be relied upon. He's not a credible person. But this is the transmission from Sinai until present day. Now there's a question. We find Pirkei Avos, this section, this tractate. It's a tractate. It has no Gemara on it, just Mishnah. And we find it in the section of torts. The Zikin. Seemingly, if you're giving us the background, the history of the written and the oral law, it should begin at the very beginning of the Talmud. The first tractate in the Talmud is Brachos, laws which pertain to blessings, Kriya Shema, the Amidah, blessings we say on food, blessings which we say on, we give thanks to God for many things, multiple blessings on mitzvos. That's all in that tractate. Seemingly, that tractate is part of the oral law. So prior to we begin discussing the oral law, Kriya Shema, whether it's one portion, what is the time, it's limited to certain times of the day, times of the night, so on and so forth, it should be predicated on the historical background of the Torah. What is the origin of the Torah? We should start. Moshe Kibul Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai, and he transmitted to Yeshua, to the elders, and so on and so forth, to the prophets. But yet, all of a sudden, in the middle of the 6 sections, in the middle of the 3rd section, Judah the Prince, who's the redactor of the oral law, he mentions it all of a sudden now, like all of a sudden, I mean, was an oversight. And because of that, he inserts it here, but he could have said it immediately, which is obvious. If I'm coming to teach you something and give you its relevance to authenticity, to the divine, give me the origin before we even start talking. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. But yet he waits till this particular tractate in the middle of the Talmud to give us the origin and where it began and how it continues to be transmitted. It's a question which is asked. Now, why did Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, who's known as Judah the Prince, why on the Torah level, the oral law is not permitted to be committed to writing? It's a Torah violation. But yet Judah the Prince committed the oral law to writing, and he had to have a basis for it. Nobody's above the law. There has to be some kind of illusion in the Torah itself, which allows, due to certain circumstances, you should be able to record the oral law. Otherwise, it's a Torah violation. Initially, it was all committed to memory. The only thing which was written was the written law. Now, there's a verse in Tehillim where David HaMelech says, King David says, Eis lasos lashem heferet torasecho. It means there's a time you must do for God where there's a question where the Torah will be nullified. If there's a question Torah is going to be nullified, then you must do for God. What's the background on this? If you read just some history, the Romans destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, the second temple. The Romans entered into Israel 186 years before the destruction of the second temple. Second temple stood 420 years. The Romans, the level of barbarism and cruelty is unmatched by any conquerors of Israel. If you read, there's a work known as Josephus. He was a historian, of course he was a general, whether he was a Jew, whether he joined the Roman legions, whether his narrative of the destruction is accurate, because he was there, he was playing up to the Romans, but he writes there, without a question, that literally there were rivers of blood flowing in the streets of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. That was the level of carnage that the Romans brought upon the Jews. They slaughtered them like cattle in the streets. That's what it was. And the decrees, not to be imagined, decrees against Judaism. I'll give you an example. The Talmud tells us that after destruction of the temple for many years, there was a law that a Roman citizen, if he should meet a Jew, he had an obligation to kill him. And if he did not kill him, he's subject to the death penalty. That's how extreme the laws were. Then they let up and they said, one doesn't have an obligation to kill, but if you kill, you will not be prosecuted because the life of a Jew has no value whatsoever. And afterwards they said, it's up to each person to do what he wants. But and then they had we know Rabbi Akiva, who's one of the 10 martyrs, who was butchered by the Romans. They scathed the flesh off his body. Why was he put to death? Because there was a decree that one was not permitted to teach Torah. And Rabbi Akiva publicly taught the Torah. And therefore, he was put to death in the most cruel way. As I said, he was literally hacked to death. They sold his flesh in the Roman meat market. What kind of barbarians these people were. With that degree of cruelty, with all the decrees, you weren't permitted to circumcise yourself, you weren't permitted to observe the Shabbos, you weren't permitted to study Torah. What happens? Unless you commit that oral law to writing, because of all the levels of distraction and survival, what's the likelihood you can remember the oral law exactly, precisely, as it was transmitted at Sinai? It's unlikely. So what did Judah the Prince do? Judah the Prince lived in the Roman era, and it was a time where the emperor, one of the emperors, was very benevolent and very kind to the Jews. And he annulled many of those decrees. And he had a special relationship with Judah the Prince. And during that time, Judah the Prince made a decision that it's now or never, that unless the Torah, the oral law is recorded accurately, precise as was given at Sinai, if we allow this to repeat itself, people are going to be forgetting. They're not going to remember the Torah in its accurate, exact form, and that's the end of Judaism. Because without the oral law, there's no written law. Written law has no value. And therefore, this was Eis Lasos Lashem. David says in Tehillim, there's a time you must do for God when the Torah will be nullified. Since Judaism was going to be nullified, because Judaism is not a man-made religion. It's a divine religion. Either you observe it as God had transmitted it, has dictated it, otherwise it's not Judaism. It's something else. You call it culturalism, call it what you want, but it's not Judaism. Judaism is what Moshe Kibbutz told me, Sinai. The Torah that Moshe received at Sinai, that's Judaism. It's the word of God, every aspect of it. Even the rabbinic laws that the rabbis were permitted to promulgate fences, the fences only to ensure and guarantee that the Torah law is observed properly. Because if these breaches would be allowed to take place, it's just a question of time before the Torah will be compromised. There's no longer Judaism. But outside of rabbinic laws, every other law is divine. Rabbinic laws is only to ensure and guarantee, and that's what they refer to as fences. The fences are to protect the written law and the oral law, it should remain intact. Even to the point where the fences, we don't even fulfill the Torah obligation. For instance, if Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, although Rosh Hashanah is a Torah obligation to blow the shofar, the rabbis legislated, in that situation, one does not blow the shofar on Shabbos. One does not hear the blast of the shofar on Shabbos. Why? Because there's a concern that if a person's not adept in blowing the shofar, he may transport the shofar in public domain, which is a Torah violation, transporting in public domain to take it to a rabbi to teach him how to blow the shofar. And since that's a concern, they said, this year, there is no blowing of shofar. They suspend the mitzvah, even though it's a Torah obligation. They were empowered by the Torah to have the ability to legislate fences, each and where the Torah law is suspended. And one does not fulfill it. There's a law, an onain. An onain is a person, somebody, one of his 7 relatives passes away. Before the burial, that person is not permitted to perform a mitzvah. One doesn't put on tefillin, one doesn't say Shema, one eats even to a sated point, one does not say Birchas HaMazon, that's grace after meals. One doesn't do any of that, even though it's a Torah obligation. You must, because you must attend and be focused on the needs of the deceased. Out of respect, the rabbis suspended all obligations. You have no obligation whatsoever. And you're not permitted, because that's a disrespect to the deceased. But that's rabbinical. But the rabbis were empowered to such a degree to preserve the Torah and to maintain its dignity and its preciseness, and it should be accurate. They were empowered by God to be in that position. They're even empowered if there's a situation where there may be a breach and somebody may behave inappropriately. Although it's only rabbinic law, the rabbis are empowered, they're permitted to put that person to death, because that person's behavior puts Judaism in jeopardy. And that's what King Solomon says, Poregs gedi shechenu nochosh. One who breaches the fence, he deserves to be bitten by a snake. Meaning, because once you breach the fence, it's just a question of time before the whole house caves in, falls apart. He would be bitten by the snake, talking about a poisonous snake. Identically, if there's a situation where a person is behaving in a manner where he mocks and his misbehavior undermines Judaism, the Sanhedrin have a right to put that person to death. To protect Judaism, it should not be disgraced and desecrated to that degree. So back to the question. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, who's the redactor of the oral law, why this Mishnah, the first opening Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which he gives us the origin and the background of where it all began and how it was transmitted from generation after generation. Why wasn't this Mishnah, the introductory Mishnah of the Talmud, before we begin the first section of Brachos? This should have been the first Mishnah. That's the question. You know, anybody who studies ethics of our fathers, which Pirkei Avos, chapters of our fathers, the level of wisdom of these people with Tanoim, they're the era of the Mishnaic period. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Gamliel, Hillel, Shammai, these are the greatest Torah sages in our history. You'd say they have such a profound understanding of behavior of human being, ethics, morals. They could have been sociologists to set norms and basis and foundations of human behavior. If you read, it's called ethics. You could think ethics. What is the basis for Jewish ethics? So Jewish business ethics, that really has to do with, that's the law, because that's rooted. Is it stealing? Is it misleading? Whatever way you want to say. So it's clear. That has to do with the divinity of Torah. But human behavior, you should make the poor feel like they're members of your household. You should make the rabbis, you should turn your home into a gathering location with Torah sages. This is something very appropriate. Meaning, put your eggs in the right basket. Invest your life properly. Torah should be primary, everything else be secondary. That's good advice. So I would think, because they were on top of the mountain, they had this level of clarity, therefore they're advising us properly. There's a beautiful allegory in the Mesilas Yesharim, Path of the Just, which was authored by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal. He writes over there, he cites a Gemara in Tractate Bava Basra, based on a verse in the Torah, that it's essential one should do a continuous self-accounting, self-audit yourself in introspection. Because, we take things for granted. We assume we're in a good place, but unless you go, and it's referred to a cheshbon hanefesh, do a personal accounting, you may not be where you should be. So always, by understanding, at the end of the day, take an accounting of the day. Was your day invested properly? Maybe what you thought was right wasn't right. Or what you did right, maybe you could have done it better. So by making that self-evaluation every day, and at the end of the week, at the end of the month, and ultimately before Shoshana, before the day of judgment, if continuously you kept house in such a focused, meticulous way, when it comes to the day of judgment, you'll be in a good place. Because there's an ongoing self-auditing system that we audit ourselves to make sure that we weed out the negative and we try to upgrade the positive. Qualitatively, it should be more. That's what we do. It's called the cheshbon hanefesh. And it's based on a verse, and the rabbis very strongly advise you to do this. And he says, and how do we know that they're right? Why is their advice so right, besides being based on interpretation of the verse? So they explain with an allegory. In the medieval times, the barons and the princes and the royalty, they would have all kinds of, have games. What was a game? It was a contest. They'd have a maze. The maze was made up of hedges, which were about 30 feet high. And within these hedges, and you couldn't look over the hedges. Within these hedges, you had various pathways. And every pathway looked exactly like the other. And unless you had a very keen eye, were you able to figure out how to get out of this maze. But there was only one exit to the maze. And sometimes you were just locked in there, you couldn't get out. So what did somebody do? Somebody went who wanted to help these people to get out of this turmoil, this inextractable such situation. He took a ladder, and the ladder was higher than the hedges. And by standing above the hedges, he was able to see every pathway, which pathway came to a dead end, and which pathway led to the exit. And as the people are in this maze, these pathways, he stands above and he's advising them exactly right, left, exactly where they should go, where they should not go, where they will be at a dead end, and where ultimately there'll be that exit strategy. So because they're on top of the maze, they're able to advise you. The Chachomim, our Torah sages, they're on top of the mountain. They see from the top and they look down. They've been through the thick and thin of all these issues, all the trials and tribulations of life. And because they're well-weathered in life, they can advise you properly. Although it looks inane, it looks kosher, it looks even advantageous, it could be disastrous. So by following their advice and the direction and the dictates, that's the only way you're able to navigate life. Similar to the person on top of the hedges advising the people in this confusing state how to shed some light on their lives to be able to exit from this morass of who knows what. Okay, that's the Mesillas Yesharim. That's the Ramchal in the Path of the Just. Now, we used to speak today, it's unheard of. There used to be an expression, sage wisdom. Person goes 190 IQ, goes to every university, has 16 PhDs and who knows what else after his name. The guy's life is a disaster. There's no financial problem he can't figure out. The guy's a rainmaker, but the guy's drowning in his life. He's drowning in the muck of who knows what. But you're such a genius. Genius has nothing to do with wisdom. The man has no relevance to wisdom. Wisdom is another level. Just excuse me for one moment. So you think that the rabbis of ethics of our fathers, chapters of fathers, these people, because they had sage wisdom, beyond sage wisdom, they're advising us properly. But it's unrelated to the divine. As a result of that, the beginning of the Talmud doesn't have to start. Kriya Shema, we know, is divine. You have to accept the yoke of heaven twice a day. Tefillin is divine. Shabbos is divine. Holidays are divine. We know that. But what about ethics and morals? Maybe this was originally, these are the societal values. And there were people who had sage wisdom. There was originally Hammurabi's code, which has something, reflects slightly the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, adultery, whatever it says over there. So there are certain basic values, because you can't have a society without certain values. Similarly, you can't have a society unless there's human relationships where people are giving and people do not withhold, and people have quality characteristics, sterling character, whatever it is. It's all, the rabbis are geniuses. That's such an understanding of the human psyche. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, Judah Prince says, no, has nothing to do with this. Every word, every value, every ethic, every moral, which is communicated in this tractate, Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai. Everything is rooted in the divine, every word. And as a result of this, societal values change. The Torah itself is immutable, just as Tefillin is immutable, Shabbos is immutable, Shema is immutable. Ethics and morals of the Torah are immutable. How a Jew has to behave. It's irrelevant what the world says or wants or dictates. Irrelevant. The Jew, as he has to wear tefillin, he has to follow the dictate which we study in this tractate. Because this is part of Torah. This is not just living a quality life. This is the way the Jew is supposed to live. I once asked the question, how do we differentiate between a human being and any other living creature? Every other living creature, what is the basis for its behavior? Instinctive. Everything's instinctive. Based on its DNA, it behaves a certain way. A dog doesn't behave like a cat, and a cat doesn't behave like a grasshopper or like a snake. Every species has its mode of behavior, and it's ingrained, it's instinctive based on its DNA, the way God created it. A human being has certain instinctive ability, but a human being has choice. We could do many things. We could override our instinct. We could delude ourselves. And we could go against the grain. Choice is choosing not to go after what we're inclined to do. Reining in ourselves. That's free choice. And we read in Pirkei Avos, Lefum Tzaragra. The more difficult the choice is, the greater is the value of the action. Because it shows a greater degree of dedication to God, that despite the temptation, despite the challenge, you did the right thing. That's the concept of Lefum Tzaragra. According to the difficulty, that is the determining factor in the reward. That's the way it is. But yet, there's a positive commandment, which is stated towards the end of the Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy, that every community that has 120 people must have a court of 23 judges, which are qualified to rule on the death penalty and corporal punishment. In addition, you have a law enforcement agency to guarantee that those verdicts are going to be delivered, the death penalty. Now, if a person eats the volume of an olive of a piece of non-kosher meat, and he's forewarned, and he eats it, what is the level of punishment? It's called lashes. You know what lashes is? Lashes means the person is whipped. And if he could survive the whipping 39 times, he's whipped. When he's whipped in this manner, the person remains incapacitated for 2-3 years till he recovers. So which man in his right mind, for the sake of tasting the McDonald's burger, the volume of an olive, is going to take this chance to suffer such penalty that he's actually put out of commission for a few years, or crossed lines where it's going to cost him his life. The person has to be insane. You know, as they say, Big Brother's watching. You can't escape. Every town has this court and has this law enforcement agency. So I asked the question, but if life is for choice, let man have his own choice. You're actually limiting his choice because you're bringing such a level of understanding. It's not worthwhile to do the wrong thing because the punishment is so extreme and so severe. But yet it's a positive commandment that every community which has a small number of people must have this kind of judicial system with law enforcement. What's the understanding? The answer is, it's true. God says, don't commit adultery, incest. Don't steal, don't embezzle, don't all this. But you know something? If you're a prince, the king doesn't want the prince even to be exposed to such an environment. You know what? I want your choice to in what context it should manifest itself. When you do a mitzvah, do you do the mitzvah qualitatively or not qualitatively? Do you do it lishma, not lishma? When you speak, do you speak negative about another person? But even though on a Torah level it's not negative, but even if it has dustings of negativity, even that you don't. I want my child to be refined, a quality Jew. I don't want him to become a subhuman, to be a predator, to commit murder and adultery, rape, and all this. That's not for my children. That's for the world. Therefore, in the Jewish communities, every community has this lockdown situation, which doesn't allow all that other stuff to seep in. That's what it's about. So the morals and ethics for us are immutable. And there's no question, but the world is behaving differently. The world has no relevance to us. The world doesn't eat kosher. The world doesn't this. It's irrelevant what the world does. You know, the animal eats raw meat. The animal is not subject to certain bacteria. But you're not an animal, you're a human being. We have a different system. The Jew has a different spiritual system. Based on that system, you're limited and you're given a prescription of life, how to live. You have negative commandments, positive commandments. A human being needs certain infusion of protein, vitamins. We need infusion. It's called Torah. That's mega energy. That's eternal energy. The non-Jew has no relevance to that because the non-Jew has a different soul. As a result of that, God says, just live like a civilized human being. Don't murder, don't kill, don't rape. Don't become an idolater. Just walk basically a straight line. Outside of that, you do whatever you want. Eat what you want, do what you want, as long as you don't cross these lines. Therefore, to prevent that misunderstanding, he puts it right in the middle here. The first tractate, it's obvious these are Torah laws. These are divine. But what's not obvious, God says, which is ethics and morals, God has to give you the introduction of Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai, the origin, the transmission from Sinai, from God, throughout the generations. Nothing has changed from Sinai till today in terms of the way the Jew must behave with his fellow man, with the society, and how to understand value of whatever we do.